Hi, I am Dr. Gloria Boutte, and I'm a Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. I'm going to be talking about African diaspora literacy. You see in the backdrop there uh, the cover of a 2018 book that was co-published by Lamar Johnson, Brenda Green, Diwana Smith, and myself. Um, and the title is African Diaspora Literacy, the Heart of Transformation in K-12 Schools and Teacher Education. And so this is really a really perfect time to talk about African diaspora literacy, as is any time, because the topic is timeless. Africa is the cradle of civilization, and African diaspora people make up about 20% of the world's population, so it's always timely. But the United Nations declared 2015 to 2024 the International Decade for People of African Descent to call attention to the pervasive injustices and inequities faced by Black people everywhere. Other evidence and global recognition of the need to embrace the humanity of Black people can be seen in the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is a perfect time, although the topic is timeless. In 1992, Dr. George King first coined the term diaspora literacy. And she said it is Black people's knowledge of our collective story and cultural dispossession. As I write about the work extending from hers and building on hers, I emphasize the term African, even though it's very clear that's what she's talking about. And she also uses the term as well now. But African diaspora literacy is the process of helping people become literate about African descendant people's cultures, languages, histories, ways of knowing, and so forth. So it's becoming literate. That's what the literacy piece means. Knowing something about, knowing this well. It relates to people within with African origins, wherever we are in the world. So whether we're in the Caribbean, in Africa, US, Brazil, Europe, and so forth. African diaspora literacy relates to us. And this is just a map to the right during the European slave trade of some of the many places that our ancestors were sent, so you can see we were sent virtually all over the world. And with us, we carried those Africanisms. No, we acknowledge with African diaspora literacy that African people are not monolithic, but at the same time, we share a collective history. And that's just a picture to the right of the African Union, which you see includes the 5 regions in Africa and also people anywhere outside the African diaspora. So think about African diaspora literacy as Black people's knowledge of our collective stories and cultural dispossession. African diaspora literacy challenges and critiques social inequities while building the racial and ethnic uplift of Black people who are minoritized in society. And so diaspora literacy, a principle is begin with the history of African people. As Dr. Carter G. Woodson told us in 1933 in his book, his now classic book, The Miseducation of the Negro, the education of any people should begin with the people themselves. So let's just kind of lean into that for a minute. Should begin with the people themselves. But he says Negroes thus trained have been dreaming about the ancients of Europe and about those who have tried to imitate them. in school, even they were made to scoff at their own language, and rather than study African tongues and understand that there's a rich tongue. So when we think about African diaspora literacy and how we can translate that into preschool through university classrooms, we never start history of Black people with enslavement. That's a timeline. Tony Bowder, I'm showing, that there's like 8,000. He's showing 8,000 years of African history. And what's interesting about it is, hopefully you can see this pointer. This man who has the pink and green and yellow scarf around his neck, he's standing right at the point where enslavement began. So there's like all this history before, about 6,000 years of history before that time. And yet we start here. So you can see how if we're going to become literate about the African diaspora, we definitely have to start with Africa. In fact, in my book, Educating African American Students and How the Children, I suggest that these are 3 key themes to teach about. As we're teaching, it doesn't matter what your content is. This can be interdisciplinary. African life before contact with Europeans, we need to see what that was. We need to continue that whole process, including for us, African and African American life at the time of contact with the Europeans and thereafter. In your case, it could be, Caribbean people at the time of contact. What changed about the culture? In fact, in the U.S., some people refer to Africans as AUSA, A-U-S-A, Africans in the USA. But that means that our culture has morphed while also retaining Africanisms. And how does that look? What does that mean? And then we want to teach about contemporary African and African American life, or contemporary Caribbean and African and Caribbean American life. So you want to show the continuum, this whole idea of people. And in a program that my husband and I use called Doctors of the Diaspora, we teach these 6 different major periods in the U.S. You can think about what it means for you wherever you are geographically. So in the Caribbean, what that might just look like. But part of African diaspora literacy is teaching about ancient Africa, the many different kingdoms that existed: Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Ethiopia, Kush, and so forth. What happened during enslavement? And all of this, by the way, we show African legacies and strengths that have let people survive during these periods, and not only survive, but excel. We show the continuity of how these things, even though they morph, how they remain the same. So enslavement, we tell the story from a sense of agency, and emphasize resistance, Reconstruction, what happened in that period: Jim Crow, segregation, civil rights, Black nationalism, and all the way to contemporary time here and for people in the diaspora. So we get the idea of we become literate about people. These are just drawings from children who have been able to illustrate some of the things they learned in the curriculum about those different periods, historical periods. And one thing you'll notice that you'll see these Adinkra symbols because we emphasize, we use the Adinkra symbols sort of as a proxy for African values, even though we know there are thousands of systems around. This one was accessible. And we show how, like, a value of hope, how you see it through all those periods. But that's part of becoming literate about the African diaspora. What are those narratives that are out there? What are those counter narratives that are out there? So we finally think about African diaspora literacy as important for healing the humanity of Black people, which has been and is being attacked. And as writer Alice Walker says, the healing begins where the wound was made. And we know the wound was made at the time of initial contact with the European, continuing to contemporary times. And she says the injury lives longer in the mind than at the point of injury. So that means intergenerationally, the trauma, the violence that has been put forth against Black people, still lives in our mind, in our DNA. And in order to heal, African diaspora literacy teaches us those stories that were taken away from us. It's an attempt to remember, as Dr. King and others say, means to put back together. Remember the history. And that is the thing that will heal us. Now, part of the difficulty in effectively teaching children from African diaspora backgrounds in ways that are healing and restorative is that many educators do not understand or respect Black culture and believe that content taught in school is neutral and cultural free, and don't realize that it's very, very Eurocentric. And, there's an erasure, distortions, inaccuracies around African diaspora people. And part of African diaspora literacy is teaching some of these Africanism that were first documented by Wade Borkin, and other people over the years have sort of replicated wherever African people are, these different dimensions: spirituality, harmony, movement, verb, affect, communalism, expressive individualism, oral tradition, social time perspective, perseverance, improvisation. So these are things that need to be included in our curriculum, in our instruction. In fact, we intimate that you not only need to teach about Black people and African descendant people, but what we can learn from them as well. So that's what African diaspora literacy is all about. It's important for all ethnic groups, so it's not just for African people. It's important to white students. This is a picture my husband and I use in our curriculum called Doctors of the Diaspora to teach a group of white students, in this case, and in many cases we have, about the history so that they know. So all of this, you can think about it, if you need a symbol to kind of put it all together, it's probably Sankofa. And most people know the Adinkra symbol of the Sankofa bird. It's a mythical bird. Its body is pointed forward to represent the future, and its head is looking backwards to represent the past. And it's holding an egg in its mouth to represent the children. And so African diaspora literacy is about the importance of returning and getting the history so we can be whole. And an African proverb, the best way to fight an alien and oppressive culture is to embrace your own. So if we're African people, this is what we need to do. And these are some references you'll have in terms of reading and learning more about it, including our new book, We Be Loving Black Children, Learning to Be Literate About the African Diaspora. This is a very short book because we wanted it to be accessible to families, to communities, to organizations, and so forth. So I hope that was helpful.